a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, framers and reframers, visionaries and revisionaries, storytellers and re-storytellers. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm someone who is constantly excavating old experiences and revisiting them, rethinking them, and re-recording them in short. And I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm a bit obsessed by the RE, the re prefix, because Lidia Yuknavitch's new memoir, Reading the Waves, is about the practice of rereading as a possible shape-shifting experience and as a way to essentially reclaim crucial stories in our lives and tell them through a different lens. And so shape-shifting is Lydia's word, and Reading the Waves is essentially a book about ways to re-enter our own memories and rearrange the pieces so that we might change and grow. And I think it's interesting because the re prefix means repetition or return, but it also means renewal. And I think Lidia would like that definition because the purpose of her book is to recast some stories that she's been carrying too long, as she puts it, literally carrying them in her body.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ironically, Lidia is also a rare repeat guest for us. So we are on the Rees today. She was on 5 years ago, Grant, believe it or not. Feels like yesterday to me. And on the other hand, that was 2020 and we're in the heart of the pandemic. And I remember every guest who came on sort of being like, what is happening? Where are we going from here? But that was when her collection of short stories, Verge, came out. And one of the interesting things about hosting this podcast is how certain guests say things that affect us deeply. And I very much remember you and Lidia bonding over the French author Nathalie Sarraute and how she changed your notion of plot with her book Tropisms, which is a tiny little thing, I have to say, because after you two bonded over that, I bought it and I thought it was, something every writer should have. It even fits in a man purse.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to go test that right after the podcast. I got a man purse myself. That was a super and really wonderful moment for me because I think there is just a type of tyranny of plot that most writers learn, most specifically through Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey or the kind of escalating action in the triangle of the 3-act structure known as Freytag's pyramid. And each of those are perfectly good ways to tell a story. I don't really want to disparage them, but they haven't truly worked for me. Yet I thought for years, even decades, that I thought I had to write that way because they're so widely taught as the way to tell a story. And Lidia confessed much the same when she was on the podcast until she discovered Tropisms, which was, really more about these tiny pivots of life, the almost imperceptible movements that most of us live within. And she talks more about that in our interview today. And Lidia calls them intensities, a word that I really like, and I've adopted that as well. They're the micro movements in life, the non-events, as she puts it. And I read an interview that she did with Cheryl Strayed recently on Cheryl's Substack, and Lidia said, I am certainly drawn to art and writing by people, living and dead, that zooms in on this smaller world. For example, Willem de Kooning's idea that content is in fact tiny, not dramatic or large, or Virginia Woolf talking about little daily miracles or moments of being. And in her book by the same title, Moments of Being, Virginia Woolf writes about, the opposite moments too, those mundane aspects of daily life that often dull our awareness, which she hilariously calls cotton wool. and part of what Woolf was doing, so ahead of her time, was capturing those moments of being, of aliveness and of intensities, for whatever reason she was called to self-express, but certainly to bear witness to experience. So it's always nice for me to share an aesthetic, in a way of seeing the world with a favorite author. And I know we both feel that way about Lidia.
Definitely. I just enjoy talking with her so much and enjoy especially reading her. I mean, only had the chance to talk to her twice, but what a privilege, right? And I'm interested about reading the waves, especially because of what we're talking about today, this word shape-shifting. Our stories aren't static. And so it is interesting when the premise of a memoir is shifting with time. I mean, it's an eventuality, I guess. And it's also why we hear so many people talking about how important it is, or that they're grateful that they waited to write their memoir, because the memoir is so different now than it would have been 20 years ago. I mean, that happened when we had the guest Susan Ito on and said, thankfully I did wait because my story changed so much. And then there's another kind of thing that happens. I'm thinking in particular of a guest that we have coming on the show soon, Jill Cement, and Jill's book is called Consent. And that was a memoir that also kind of takes on shape-shifting because it's a reconsideration of a previous memoir that she wrote 20 years earlier. And she's taking herself to task a bit for the way that she thought about things and wrote about things from that younger version of herself. And she's setting the record straight for modern times. I'm really excited for that conversation, actually, because consent and the entire idea of what it means to reconsider a memoir was very thought-provoking for me. And I did write about it on my Substack last year in June. And of course, stories do change and we change as people and our understanding of things change. And I know we're going to get a lot more into this when we talk with Jill Cement, but for this week's show, I just wanted to plant the seed, Grant, and ask you a question. Like, how do you feel about stories that change? I guess that's, more common than not, but still, like, what do we do with it? Like Jill reconsiders or, other people have come and kind of, I guess, altered stories, republished stories, but sometimes they just live on forever.
It's really interesting because, Lydia makes this great point that, stories are always changing. We're always changing. So they're interdependent, interconnected. And it's interesting because the more I learn about the ways we perceive the world, and make memories, construct the stories of our lives, the more unstable or unreliable I think everything is. Although, that instability or unreliability is, that's just the way we do. We make stories of the world. And we're very definitely our stories. And sometimes those stories are the stories that are told to us or about us. But then when we tell the stories ourselves, we might recreate it, with a different point of view. And Lydia in her memoir tells the story of a confrontation she has with an abusive boyfriend and how she felt the story through the eyes of a bunch of guys who witnessed the scene. But then years later, retold the story through her own perspective. And she was the hero in this version. So it totally changed with that changing point of view. And I often think of psychological studies about our brain's natural tendency, to have a negative bias. That's the official psychological word for it. And we tend to err on the side of projecting negative scenarios. And we do that for evolutionary reasons, because our ability to perceive and think about worst case scenario, that keeps us safe. But negative bias can also make us create negative stories about the world. And I can't tell you the number of times I've felt fear or anxiety about some situation, and then I've made up a story with a horrible outcome, only to then have everything go completely fine. And my fears don't come to life in any way. So I think that one thing these memoirs teach us is to be really sensitive to stories and to view what happens to us through different perspectives, and to maybe not to be too sure that our perspective or version of the story is ultimately the right version. We have to be open to other perspectives and change. And then another interesting thing about our memories is how memory relies on the same or similar parts of the brain as the imagination. So our memories don't live in some sort of mental library that keeps the exact record of an experience, because we essentially rewrite our memories in some way each time we remember them. So our world and our perceptions are fictional to a degree, just by definition. And I know that one of the interesting things about writing my own memoir is how my story is changing, literally as I write it, as I probe things. And that's because we're just constantly creating ourselves.
It's really fascinating. And I think I knew, but hadn't thought about that for a long time, the idea that our memory and imagination live in the same region of the brain. And I also think that some people have great memories and other people do not. And some people believe their own constructed truths and myths and make things real that didn't happen, or live in a world of exaggeration or created identity. There's just all types out there. And the older I get, the more I feel the reality, of complexity and paradox of being a human being. Walt Whitman famously wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." These are often reference lines from his poem, Song of Myself, because sometimes I do feel challenged by people's paradoxes, even my own. But I'm also so interested in the human psyche that there's also a way that this stuff keeps us on our toes. And therefore, I'm also fascinated by this idea of how we change and shapeshift. And like with Jill Cement's book, again, Consent, like there's part of me that was fascinated and part of me that was angry and part of me that was like cheering her on, and I sort of loved that she took me on this journey of complexity, right? And since we're talking about the brain, Grant, here's another interesting biological fact, which is that the body does renew itself on a regular basis. Our skin cells renew every 120 days or so, bones every 10 years. And so we're literally not in the same body that we were in 10 years ago. And I think that's an interesting thing. Like if you're starting to see things differently or feel things differently than you did when you were young or even 10 years ago, there's actually a biological reason for that. So there's more science for you. And another person who's written rather famously about changing their stories is Kiyosa Layman. And we've talked on the show about how he bought the rights back for his book Long Division from its original publisher. The novel was first published in 2013. Kiyosa later reacquired the rights and republished a revised edition. Here we are back on our REs. But for him, that was an act of reclaiming. And I think we can put this into the category of shape-shifting too, because he shape-shifted that book to fit into something that he wanted the book to be that his original publisher did not want it to be. And so when he republished it, it was to align with the vision of what he wanted, essentially bringing it back to its origins. So I was just thinking like this shape shifting can actually go both ways. It can align to something to adhere to a new way of seeing, or it can align to how you originally wanted something to be before someone imposed a change on you. So I wonder what you think about, those two different ways of seeing it.
Yeah, I love how many shapes this idea of shape-shifting is taking, Brooke. It's going beyond my initial concepts. And one of the major stories in Lydia's new memoir is the story of Devon, her former husband, who died in a mysterious fall. And her current husband literally hired a private detective to find the details of his death, and he gives her, the things he finds, and Lydia considers it her task to essentially save his life, or her version of it, from the way it's been documented in his obituary and the police report. And she writes, "I want to revision his story away from that idiotic obituary, away from the accident report and autopsy. I want to write him back to life, even if it kills me, an impossible story. Or I want to write open a space where what he loved lives, which in the end was not me, even if it was briefly. I understand how that love is always the fall." And she writes about the fall, and she writes about him and her memories. And in the writing, shapes shift, and she's able to release the story she's carried for so long and kind of breathe through another one.
Yeah, it's really an interesting exploration. And Lydia is a truth teller by definition. And she even notes how she's a malformation junkie, that she loves form but hates forms that are conventional, well-received, or traditional and pleasing. And she writes, "I love the monster." And this book is definitely hard-hitting. She reveals herself in so many ways, not surprising because she's done that in the past, but she writes stories of love affairs, sexual encounters, physical abuse, marriage, parenthood, substance abuse. One thing that's interesting is that many of the memories that she detailed in her 2011 memoir, Chronology of Water, are reconfigured and shaped by passing time. I love this, Grant. She writes, "Being, like imagination, is trans. It moves across, beyond, through, change, shape-shifting, interbeing, interspecies." The two books should really be read together. And it also reminds me of her Facebook posts, because it's just how she writes is so beautiful. And she often reaches for these, just powerful words.
Well, I'll put that on my list of one of my dream courses that I'd like to either take or teach, to thoroughly compare the two books. It'd be so nice to read them side by side. So I can't wait to talk with Lydia about shape-shifting, memory, storytelling, and the prefix re, which we've been using a lot, after this short break. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm super excited to welcome back Lidia Yuknavitch to Right Minded. Lydia originally appeared on the show in 2020. Lydia is the national best-selling author of 4 novels, Thrust, The Book of Joan, Adora, A Head Case, and The Small Backs of Children, which was the winner of the 2016 Oregon Book Award's Ken Kesey Award for Fiction. The Misfits Manifesto is based on her popular 2016 TED Talk, The Beauty of Being a Misfit, and that was published by TED Books. Verge, a collection of short fiction, was released in 2020, and her widely acclaimed memoir, The Chronology of Water, was a finalist for a Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. And her newest memoir, Reading the Waves, which we're going to talk about today, was just published by Riverhead Books. Welcome, Lydia.
My complete pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful.
Super excited to talk about your memoir, which I loved. And Lydia, Brooke and I have been delving into the nature of memory and retelling stories and all the ways we shift shapes as a result. That's your word. So I'd love to start there. You write, I believe our bodies are carriers of experience. I mean to ask if there is a way to read my own past differently, using what I have learned from literature, how stories repeat and reverberate and release us from the tyranny of our mistakes, our traumas, and our confusions. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about how this approach informs reading the waves, essentially how you read the waves of your life, in short.
Well, the idea of those sentences comes from my profound love of literature and art. And a thing that's so beautiful to me about reading literature is that when I reread something that I love, it's different every time. And I don't think that's just me talking. I think that's other people too. And the books and the pages don't change, which must mean I do. So I'm a different person and I'm bringing something different to the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was meditating on that very deeply and thinking about my own past and memoir writing and memory. And I thought, well, why don't we have another look at our own story experiences and how we've been telling them our whole lives? Why do we hold on to them so tightly? Like, what's at stake? And especially the stories that are hard for us that we're carrying around of things that have happened to us. Is there maybe a way to do what I do when I come differently to literature, to stand in a different place or a different vantage point or ask different questions? And I think the answer turns out to be yes. And it's not like I'm a wizard. I know this isn't, gigantic, profound news, but it was a new experience for me to really engage with that question and literally go stand somewhere else.
Well, part of the shape shifting in your story is changing point of view, writing in the third person instead of first person. And so when talking about your ex-husband, Devin, you said it helps to write about us in third person, that slight distance that didn't happen. How did that shift from first person to third help change the shape of your story about Devin?
Well, when you're reading a novel or a poem and you imagine different characters and you're kind of invested in the characters, so they're sort of you, but they're not exactly you because, I'm not actually whoever that character is. But you imagine this kind of standing in their clothes and their shoes and doing what they do. And it releases you from the stuff you already know about yourself that's very limiting. Like I already know all my flaws.
You think?
Most of them.
Most of them, yeah.
Most of them.
I still have some that are appearing.
Okay, I take that back. I mean, more are coming, I'm sure. But, they tend to limit our vision and our ways of experiencing things. But if we shift point of view and I'm suddenly an owl or I'm a horse, I see things differently. I smell things differently. I come to different conclusions. I behave differently. Different things harm me. Different things give me hope. And so if I allow myself to explore story space and characters and shape-shifting like I do in fairy tales or fables or literature, lo and behold, it opens up different, attitudes and aspects. And I keep coming back to this idea that you can bring better questions than why does this hurt or why do I suck? Like you don't get very far with why do I suck?
Yeah, that's not necessarily a big opening question, I guess. That's a good segue, actually. I was recently listening to Monica Lewinsky's story in her interview on her podcast, Reclaiming. And it's fascinating to hear her talk now about her present self compared to the 24-year-old self, that was at the center of a global scandal. It's really fascinating. And one thing that stands out, of course, is how our life story changes and then changes again with time. just as you said, and we never create the one true story in our life, in other words. And you ask, I'm going to quote from your book, what if we could read our own past, our memories, even our bodies, as if they too were books open to endless interpretations? And you just said that essentially earlier, but I wondered about the notion of this endless interpretation. And as a writer and a person, I love viewing life like this because it just opens me up to the world and myself. But I also kind of wondered if it could be destabilizing, but then maybe destabilizing is good because maybe that's life.
Yeah. Wow. Those are really great questions and ideas. The destabilization, yeah, it's tricky for sure. I met Monica Lewinsky once, the same TED Talk series I was in. She was there and she wouldn't remember me. And I walked up to her, like with my finger up my nose. Hi, I'm Lidia. I'm a writer. She's like, that's nice. Go away, blonde lady. But, we have this idea we work with at Corporeal Writing a lot. We even have a t-shirt that says this, which is, I'm not the story you made of me.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that's such a fluid idea and story space is that people project their stories onto us quite a bit in life. Or if you tell a story about yourself, people hold on to it really tightly, like that's the only thing you can ever tell. And she's a great example of that, like how you can be trapped or kind of burdened or held down by a certain kind of story. And so, yeah, there's still a danger that can lead to a destabilization if you start rearranging story elements or moving the story around. But I do believe it's, as you said, that we are dissolving and reconstituting all the time, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And the word for that is change. And change is life.
Mm-hmm.
And stasis is kind of nothingness. And so it can be painful, but, we're sloughing off skin cells every moment and hair, and we're dying and living and dying and living every moment we're alive. And so that's the expanded, beautiful way to think about it, even though sometimes it's also really scary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is such an interesting conversation, Lydia, so much about the nature of memory being called into question. You write memories are conjurings, and I really love that. And memories aren't just events that happen to us. We make them, they make us, we make them again. And then there is a degree of choosing the story of our lives, especially for writers, and I think a lot of people are conscious of that, especially when they start working on their memoirs. You quote Jeanette Winterson, who wrote, "If you continually write and read yourself as fiction, you can change what's crushing you." And so I wanted to ask you about that. Did you make choices like this? And I imagine you did. And did writing this book change your life?
100%. Everything I've ever written changes my life a little bit. I think my DNA gets rearranged. You can see why I was attracted to that Winterson quote, because we were just talking about that the volume on shapeshifting is turned up when you think about what she's saying. The same with Virginia Woolf, that you can rearrange pieces of your life in a different arrangement than whatever quote unquote happened to you. Those ideas are profound to me because locking in on one version of what happened kind of makes you into this 2D stuck image of yourself. And whatever happens to us happens. I'm not suggesting we change that. We're marked by the things that have happened to us. I'm suggesting we are ever able to move around in a 360 and be in relationship to what happened to us differently. And that's why her quote is so meaningful to me, because I agree. And as we were talking earlier, story space, the space of fiction. And for me, fairy tale and fable in particular allows for transmography. And I mean that both in terms of like what happens to frogs and butterflies, but I also mean it in terms of in what ways are we growing a new wing or a new tail to move through our own lives differently, instead of I'm going to have this broken heart my whole life and it's going to be the same broken heart my whole life, and that's just it. That's all there is.
It always feels that way with a broken heart.
It does.
I've got to say.
I'm right with you.
Well, you mentioned, how moving around in a 360-degree, circle changes all the things it touches, I guess. And I was thinking, per a quote that you mentioned in your book, what people do to one story can affect all stories, And you write about an early experience where your mother catches you engaged in sexual activities with a girl and then ends that relationship. And you write, my mother's early erasure of my erotic experience with a girl hides underneath every story. So I was very curious about that, about how that hides under every story and what that means.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of shine a flashlight on a becoming moment. Like I was right on some kind of threshold, maybe, of becoming one thing. And the shame, the shaming incident, which so many of us go through in our lives, but also my mother and I never could quite perfectly love each other. So it was not just shame, but some kind of, I wanted to love my mother so much, and that deepened the cavern between us in a way that I just, it wounded me for life. And so a whole lot is in that scene. And I'm far enough away from it now to go back and look at it and maybe retrieve some of the soul and some of the, beauty and some of the desire and some of the love. And I think those retrievals, I know we all know what soul retrieval is. And I'm not exactly talking about that because I think in terms of narrative and stories, but it's certainly kindred with other disciplines' ideas about soul retrievals. I think it's good to go back and get the pieces of yourself that didn't die and could maybe be rearranged in your present tense.
It's beautiful, and that's quite an invitation to some of our personal writers and memoirists out there, I think. There's another episode where you write about a boyfriend you call the poet. He's abusive. He nearly kills you in his boat. And then when a towboat rescues you, you choose not to get in it, but to swim alongside it to shore. And then when you arrive on the shore, you encounter a bunch of cheering guys. And then you have to go home with the poet. And you write, what would it take for the story to undergo a release, an adaptation, so that a woman emerging triumphantly from water might carry the heart of the matter instead of the fucked up fist of things that came? Why can't I be the swimmer? Why can't a woman be the epic novel of herself? Then you do write that version here in this book. So could you speak more to that transformation?
Yeah, when I was in process writing that part over and over again, draft after draft, trying to figure out what the hell I was trying to say, it deeply occurred to me that my novels do that. In my novels, there's always some brave, courageous young girl who's I write her as glorious and triumphant and Valkyrie-like over and over again. And so that's where she lives, I guess, for me. And there was this other interview I was in with OPB with Dave Miller, and he teared up and he goes, "Don't you see that was you?" And I felt compassion for him because he was tearing up. And I get it that, yeah, I did that. But the sort of stepping into the glory of a self just hasn't been my life. But I can step into the conjuring of a story. And I think that might be more useful to other people anyway.
Well, I have a couple questions that focus on words that I've noticed that you use a lot. And so I'm curious if you're conscious of them. They actually mean a lot to me. And the first one is, I don't know if you remember this, but you actually very generously blurbed my book, All the Comfort Sin Can Provide.
Of course I do.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That blurb meant so much to me and means so much to me. And you used the word slippage in the blurb. And it was the first time I'd kind of really heard that word or thought about it. You know, it was a slippage of behavior or a slippage of morals. And I thought that was exactly what it is sometimes, just like a slippage, not a bad or a conscious intention necessarily, but a part of life, you know, almost like dropping something.
Yeah.
And I noticed you use the word somewhat frequently in this book. So I just wanted to know more about what the word slippage means to you existentially.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I get really attached to individual words. And I love the idea that they could change meaning hundreds of times. That's why I return to them. It's not to redundant manner, it's reshaping. But slippages in particular, I neither believe anyone is as heroic as we want to pretend they are, nor as, you know, our mistakes aren't as horrific as we tend to believe they are, even when they're terrible. And the word slippage, like you said, carries with it this idea that it was a fraction. It was a moment. It was, you know, everything was going one way, and then a small turn happened, or like that scene with my mother, or how the boat in the lake did not hit me in the skull. Or, you know, like the way a story was almost a success story, but then it became a story of something else. Those small emotions, and I have been influenced by Virginia Woolf in this way mightily. It's those micro moments, those micro instances where our deeds take on volume or erasure. And so slippages kind of reminds me of that. Also, I'm not physically graceful.
Despite being a great swimmer?
Yeah, if you dip me in water, I become as agile as a seal. But in regular life, I'm the person with 100 bruises, and I'm going to hit my knee on the desk when I get up, and I'm going to bang my shoulder on the doorway when I'm on land, I'm bumbly. So, you know, slippages allows for a description of my experience on land that corresponds to my reality.
I love the word. So I'll try to attribute you every time I say it, because I feel like it's your word. And same with this next word. You used this in our interview in 2020, the word intensities. And it meant a lot to me, actually, when I teach plot, and I don't teach plot. I mean, that's one thing that came up in our talk, was that we'd each read Natalie Sereau, and that had kind of changed our notions of plot into these micro moments, as you mentioned.
Totally.
And so you write now, you say people are sometimes too interested in what happened, the plod of plot and action. Sometimes the rest of the story, or perhaps the heart of the story, is carried by image, repetition, tiny intensities not captured fully from plot and action. So in closing, can you tell us more about how you write with intensities?
Yes, I love this idea, as you already know, because we've sort of gotten excited about it in the past. I think we've been trained to go straight to large dramas and actions. And more than half of my life, in fact, I think most of my life, has occurred in the periphery, or slightly behind my head, or in something tiny that's going on next to the big action. But the tiny thing, the object or the gesture or the sound or the color or the light or the smell, was carrying all the meaning in a series of micro moments. And the grand action or the grand drama is almost a mirage.
I'm with you. I love that. It's my religion, kind of.
Right with you. I bow.
Yeah. I love the inspiration too from the Virginia Woolf, because we're talking about that in our banter as well, you know, in the moments of being. And when you really think about that, if you can meditate in that moment, I think you can find so much scenic detail there in your writing.
Yeah, so agree. And we also get hung up on big, huge, dramatic actions in a way that keeps us from learning what the real lessons might be.
That's interesting to think about.
Thank you, Lydia. It's great to see you again, and thanks for coming back.
Thank you. I'm so grateful and humbled and happy to be here. You guys are awesome, and you really do have the best glasses on the planet, Brooke.
Oh, thank you. I'll have to take a picture and post them somewhere so that people can see what Lydia is complimenting me on. Wow.
They're gorgeous.
Thanks so much, Lydia.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back with today's Substackin'.
Well, Brooke, I want to highlight another person's Substack today because I think it will be of particular interest to our viewers. Cheryl Strayed's Dear Sugar newsletter, which is named after her popular advice column. And I came across it because she did a super wonderful interview with Lydia. And in fact, she has a whole series of interviews with authors titled Tell Us.
I love the interview with Lydia because it touched on her new book, of course, but there were many great questions about who she is as a person. And Lydia and Cheryl both live in Portland, which has a wonderful, intimate, and lively writing scene. And I was interested to find out that they met actually 17 years ago. And there's even a photo of the two of them with perhaps the most famous Portland writer ever, Ursula Le Guin. And Cheryl actually joined Lydia's writing group back then. So that's pretty cool. And also goes to show you how writers nurture each other in their writing communities. Cheryl writes on this post, Lydia's writing is so fucking good, but let me try to say more specifically why. It's because she rings all the bells in my personal list of the 5 qualities of good writing, which are clarity, engagement, dazzlement, enlightenment, and motherfuckitude. I love Cheryl. She goes all the way in all the directions that writing can go, and she lets us swim there with her alongside her beautiful, generous heart and her drop-dead brilliant mind. Wow, what an endorsement. Mm-hmm. I also truly love those 5 qualities of good writing. We are hoping to get Cheryl on this show someday. I think we're going to have to harass her a little bit or maybe just show up in Portland.
Yeah, maybe we can get her to do a whole series of 5 episodes on each one of those words. That'd be kind of cool.
I'll just take motherfuckitude and take it home.
That's good. I like that. Let's write her with that in mind. Yeah, I definitely hope we can get her on the show because many of the authors she's profiled, I looked at the list, Pam Houston, Chelsea Beaker, Steve Almond, her Dear Sugar co-host, all of them have been on Right Minded, so we're very much peas in a pod. And I'm going to harken back to Lydia's interview for just one more Lydia quote to end today's show. The whole interview with Cheryl is just so rich, and she tells the story of how she got a wetsuit when she turned 60 and swam alongside a seal who gave her advice on shapeshifting. And Lydia also tells about a dragonfly that flew on her desk and literally died before her eyes. But here's the quote I want to leave people with. I think mistakes are portals. Mistakes are how we learn, aren't they? And they are like tiny thresholds. To be willing to risk failing or making a mistake is also to be willing to change and grow. To have a look at your own mistakes is to be willing to be all the way human. And Lydia, it's so nice the way she talks about mistakes and risks mistakes, and she probes her mistakes for, tough truths. And that's why she's a role model for being a brave writer for me. Just like Cheryl Strayed, I'll add, I love reading each of them simply for their bravery and their truth-telling.
I agree. And after all, that is also what Right Minded is all about, telling truth and writing boldly and certainly making mistakes along the way, because mistakes not only help us understand who we are as humans, they help us understand who we are as writers. Absolutely. So thank you, Right Minded listeners, for listening and writing, and we will see you as always next week.